Good morning, everyone. Her Excellency, distinguished guests, colleagues, members of the academic and research community, policymakers, and all the respective participants. I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar, Governing the Invisible Participatory Underwater Domain Awareness Framework for the Brahmaputra Basin. Today's theme points to a core challenge in water management, especially river management. We often focus on what we can see: floods, navigation, settlements, and visible parts of economic activity. But many important processes happen out of sight under the water. Factors such as sediment movement, habitat changes, water quality, aquatic life, pollution, and climate impacts are less visible but crucial to understanding and managing river basin like the Brahmaputra Basin. Over the past few years, MRC's robust team of research fellows and interns have worked on several technical and policy projects to better understand these hidden processes and support evidence-based river management. We have done river hydraulic studies, flood risk assessments, and flood forecasting. We have also studied riverbeds, floodplains, and sediment movement, and channel changes. All these efforts help us understand how Brahmaputra behaves and what shapes it over time. We have been using new tools such as marine spatial planning, river information systems, and AIS data to model rainfall, elevation, and river location to predict urban flood risk and support better planning. We also focus on ecosystem health and livelihoods. These include habitat modeling, assessing fisheries and aquaculture, identifying suitable fishing zones, studying the effects of climate change on inland fisheries, and supporting segment management policies. From environmental monitoring perspective, MRC is also researching real-time water quality systems, machine learning models for predicting water quality and assessing groundwater scenario, AI methods for estimating river nutrient levels in studies on pollution and its movement throughout aquatic ecosystems. So all these initiatives bring together fields like hydrology, ecology, fisheries, climate studies, mapping, AI, and public policy. Most importantly, they show why we need governance frameworks that integrate diverse data, disciplines, and institutions, and people to support better decision making. This is why Underwater Domain Awareness Framework, or UDA, becomes important. UDA helps us make invisible visible by bringing together science, technology, community participation, and governance to better understand and manage what is happening under the river surface. We are pleased to have Ms. Tejaswini with us today. Tejaswini Kaktikar is a research fellow at the Maritime Research Center and a final year Bachelor of Science candidate in anthropology in the University College London. Her research focuses on water security, river basin governance, and environmental policy, with particular attention to the sustainable management of Brahmaputra River Basin. Her work on participatory underwater domain awareness framework for the Brahmaputra Basin shows how digital tools and stakeholder engagement can help us better understand the river to make informed decisions and manage Brahmaputra sustainably. So before we move on to the keynote address, it gives me immense pleasure to invite Dr. Arnab Das, founder director of Maritime Research Center and Neerdhoni Technologies, to share a few words within the context of underwater domain awareness framework. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much. First of all, I must thank all our senior panelists, starting with Reba Ganguly ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us today. And we really appreciate and we eagerly wait to hear your comments on the presentation and the work that we are doing. Pandya sir, thank you so much. Former chairman of the Central Water Commission, I had the opportunity to work with sir, and it was a tremendous learning experience on working on the transboundary river with him. And Dr. Sumit Vij, thank you so much for accepting our invite, and we really look forward to hearing your comments. Dr. Mirza Rahman, I'm so grateful to you, and we always wanted somebody locally, I mean, who has been a part of the region, and your insights we very eagerly wait to listen to. And as Catherine mentioned, we are trying to, the entire underwater domain awareness framework we are trying to work on multiple dimensions. So as we talk right now, we have 36 interns at our center, ranging from the top five IITs to BITS Pilani to St. Stephen's. And you'll be happy to know we even have English literature students working with us, because the work that we are doing, we need to communicate it better, and we really appreciate their contribution. And I'm so happy that our liberal arts team has really become strong, led by Catherine herself. And we have 7 research fellows and interns working. I mean, not interns, research fellows who are representing our liberal arts group. And they are really making a very serious contribution. Catherine herself has just submitted her handbook on the marine special planning along with Ambassador Anup Mudgal, and it is under publication with Springer Nature. So we are working on multiple dimensions, and I mean, a lot of people have worked on the Brahmaputra. There are a lot of publications, but when we were discussing with Tejaswini on this work, she's coming up with her monograph on this. The whole idea was to look at the Brahmaputra from the underwater dimension. And I think Tejaswini has done a great job. And I won't take too much time to keep you waiting from her presentation. So Tejaswini, I think I'll hand over to you. Please take it on from here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ram. I will just share my presentation. So, good evening, everyone. I am Tejaswini Kaktikar, and I'm a research fellow at the Maritime Research Center and a BSc Anthropology student at University College London. First of all, thank you to our panel and to everyone joining us today for this discussion on the Brahmaputra. When we think about governing a river, we usually begin with what we can see. We see flood water spreading across the floodplain. We see banks collapsing, channels shifting, ferry routes changing, and structures come under pressure. These visible changes understandably command public attention and also institutional response. But the Brahmaputra begins to change before many of these outcomes appear at the surface. Sediment is already being redistributed, a channel is gradually becoming shallower, the riverbed is shifting, and scour may be developing, and underwater habitat conditions may have already changed. And so by the time these consequences become visible, the process producing it may be well advanced. This is what I mean by the invisible river. I'm not arguing that the Brahmaputra is unknown. It is the most studied and dynamic and strategically significant river system in the region, but that the invisibility lies in the gap between the processes shaping the river and the system through which we govern it. We, like I said, often govern the visible, a flood emergency, a disrupted route, a collapsing bank, or ecological decline that can no longer be ignored. But those conditions that produce such events have been developing underwater for weeks, months, or across several seasons. So the central question that I want to address today is, how can consequential underwater change become understandable, credible, and actionable within Brahmaputra governance? This is where the underwater domain awareness, or UDA, becomes relevant, not just as a collection of monitoring technologies and not as a promise that the river can be made completely predictable, but as a governance architecture, a structured way to connect underwater observation with interpretation, interpretation with verification, and verification with action. So my argument then begins with the difference between seeing change and being able to govern it. The problem is not simply that underwater processes are unseen. Many of them can be measured. Hydrographic surveys can show changing depths. Bathymetric mapping can reveal the form of the riverbed, and sediment profiling and repeated observation can sort of reveal deposition, scour, and morphological change. But a measurement does not explain its own significance. Think of a ferry channel gradually becoming shallower. A survey can record that change, but the data alone cannot tell us whether change is temporary, whether the channel is likely to move further, or whether another route is safe or an advisory is required. The observation only really becomes useful when it's interpreted in relation to a decision. Does the change affect navigation? Does it indicate a wider morphological shift? Is it creating an emerging risk for a nearby structure? Or who receives this information, who is responsible for responding to it? And so this is why scientific visibility at the moment does not automatically produce governance action. Information could be technically valid, but still remain institutionally inactive. It may be generated by one agency, interpreted by another, and then required by a third. And there may be no agreed threshold for action, no routine pathway through which evidence of underwater changes reaches those that are sort of responsible for preparedness, for maintenance, for ecological management, or even local warning. And so the problem is not only whether underwater processes can be observed, but also whether institutions can make those observations meaningful and credible and actionable. That becomes particularly difficult because the Brahmaputra is known through several systems that do not consistently connect. Like I said earlier, the Brahmaputra is not unknown. It's known through hydrology and flood forecasting. It's known through sediment studies and river morphology. It's known through infrastructure, navigation, ecology, fisheries, disaster management, and transboundary governance as well. And each of these systems produces a necessary and very valuable knowledge. And so the problem then lies not in specialization, but that a river of this scale and complexity cannot be understood through just one discipline or governed by just one institution. The problem is like a disconnection of sorts. Take an example of, let's say, a ferry disruption. It could be treated as an operational issue, but the processes producing it also involve deposition and channel migration. Take another example of a decline in fish catch, which could be approached as a fishery problem, but it may also reflect things like changing depth, substrate, turbidity, connectivity, and submerged habitats. And so visible consequences are clearly appearing in one sector, and the processes producing it are crossing several. The Brahmaputra does operate as a connected system, but our knowledge of it is divided by mandates and professional categories and administrative boundaries. And so this means that the basin doesn't just face a lack of information, but a lack of architecture connecting underwater change to its wider consequences. And once we sort of think about this problem in this way, the idea of invisibility takes on three distinct forms. The first form is, of course, physical invisibility, where things like sediment transport, riverbed migration, submerged habitats, and changing bathymetry are difficult to observe. This is particularly relevant in a river that is highly turbid, morphologically mobile, and capable of reorganizing itself entirely during monsoon. And so even when sort of we have the capacity to do it, it's also a literal physical constraint. The second is, of course, institutional invisibility, where even when underwater change is measured, it's divided across sectors and mandates and agencies. That, say, sediment, for example, could be treated as a navigation issue in one context, an erosion problem in another, an ecological concern elsewhere, and an infrastructure issue in another department. And each of those interpretations would be equally valid, but no institution necessarily follows that process across all of its consequences. The third is political invisibility, where access to information across the basin may be uneven. Monitoring systems may use incompatible methods, baselines may be different, and environmental change may be difficult to verify across multiple jurisdictions. And in a transboundary river like the Brahmaputra, uncertainty over what has happened can very quickly become uncertainty over why it has happened. And different actors may offer sort of competing explanations for the same change, particularly when underlying evidence cannot be compared. And so each of these forms of invisibility sort of reinforce one another. Physical invisibility limits observation, institutional invisibility limits integrated interpretation, and political invisibility limits verification. The UDA is relevant here because it offers sort of a structured response to all three. Scientific tools can strengthen observation, integrated interpretation can connect change across sectors, and comparable evidence can support verification. And sort of the need for that architecture becomes maybe most obvious when we consider the mismatch between how the river changes and how we currently respond to it. Like I said, the Brahmaputra is incredibly complex. It evolves through processes, but our current governance responds to events, crossing becoming unsafe, a bridge foundation being exposed, a flood emergency unfolding, or visible ecological decline that we just can't ignore. But at that point, the issue becomes urgent and institutionally recognizable. But the event is more often than not the final stage of a process that began much earlier. The ferry channel, for example, did not become shallow the moment a vessel encountered difficulty. Sediment had already begun to accumulate, flow had already been redistributed, and the channel form had already changed. The underwater processes almost always precede the visible disruption. And it creates sort of a temporal mismatch of sorts. If governance becomes fully active only when consequence is obvious, the opportunity for earlier and more proportionate action has already become really narrow. But I think conversely, it's also important to note that not every underwater change indicates an approaching crisis. The Brahmaputra is naturally dynamic. Channels migrate, chars form and disappear. Sediment is deposited and remobilized, and habitats do change with the river. And so the task then is not to stop the river from changing, but to be able to distinguish from expected river dynamism and change that is becoming consequential for people, for livelihoods, for ecology and infrastructure. And so the governance gap also sort of becomes clear here, that the river changes through processes, but our institutions respond mainly to visible events. And these processes develop underwater, while information about them remains divided across institutions and difficult to verify across the basin. This is where the UDA sort of comes in. It offers us a structured way to move from asking what is changing beneath the river to asking what does that change mean, who is getting affected, who needs to know, and what should follow. Its relevance in the Brahmaputra is particularly strong because underwater processes are fundamental to how this behaves. Like I said, the Brahmaputra is highly sediment intensive, braided, morphologically mobile, highly turbid, and seasonally reorganized by monsoon flows. Neither of these are separate characteristics. They interact continuously. Flow mobilizes sediment, sediment reshapes the riverbed, and the changing riverbed then redistributes flow. And that redistribution then affects broader things like bank stability and aquatic habitats and security of river-dependent communities. And so this is why also no single underwater variable can explain the Brahmaputra in its entirety, and also why surface hydrology alone, although indispensable, is not enough. Discharge tells us how much water is moving through the system, but it does not by itself tell us how the riverbed is responding, how navigation depth is altering, or why erosion is intensifying in a particular place. And so understanding the Brahmaputra and then being able to govern it requires a coupled view of all of these factors. And the UDA provides us with a framework for building that coupled view. It provides like scientific tools like hydrographic mapping and bathymetric observation, for example, with ecological information and operational knowledge and the lived experience of river communities. Its purpose then is not to simply just generate more measurements, but to turn underwater change into usable river intelligence. What the UDA adds is the ability to understand the wider meaning of underwater change. A change in depth, substrate, and turbidity and sediment movement is not just a technical observation. It may affect things like aquatic habitats and fish movement. It may affect fish productivity, fishery productivity, ferry access, navigation reliability. It may alter how communities move, work, access markets, and respond to risk. And when evidence about that same river process can be compared across institutions and jurisdictions, it also becomes strategically relevant. This is what in this slide I'm sort of describing as ecological, economic, community, and strategic intelligence. They are not four separate UDA systems, but four dimensions of the same underwater processes. Take say a shifting channel, for example. Ecologically, it may alter habitat and connectivity. Economically, it may affect navigation or fisheries. For communities, it may change access or safety or livelihood conditions. And at the basin level, different interpretations of that shift in the channel may influence how institutions understand and also communicate change in the river. Bathymetry and acoustics and various other tools that we possess all reveal different parts of that process. And so the UDA brings all of those observations into almost a common frame. And so its contribution is not the instrumentation itself, but the ability to connect a physical signal to ecological, economic, social, and strategic consequences. That connected understanding is what I mean when I say river intelligence. But producing intelligence is obviously not the end of the process. The central question remains whether that intelligence can then be integrated into governance. For that purpose, the UDA can be sort of understood as three connected levels. The first level is the UDA as instrumentation. This is including the capacity to detect underwater change through acoustic sensing, through scour monitoring, ecological observation, and sediment profiling. The instrumentation tells us that something has changed. At the second level is the UDA as intelligence. This is where the significance of that change from the first level is interpreted. What does this mean for fisheries? What does it mean for mobility and livelihoods and river security? Is it part of normal seasonal variation, or is it becoming consequential? At the third level, the UDA then becomes governance. Governance begins when interpreted evidence is connected to responsibility, where questions like who receives these findings, who decides whether it requires action, who can issue a warning or inspect a structure, adjust a route, or change a management request, how is uncertainty communicated, where questions like these are asked. And so the progression of these three levels is relatively straightforward. The instrumentation establishes what is changing. Intelligence sort of explains why that change matters, and governance determines who must respond and what should follow. This is why the UDA is not just a technical monitoring system, but a governance architecture that connects underwater evidence to responsibility and action. That architecture can also be sort of organized through four linked functions. The first function is observe. Observation sort of combines physical, ecological, operational, and community indicators. Things like a survey showing changing depth, or sediment monitoring identifying redistribution, or river users reporting changes in channels, currents, or local hazards. The second function is interpret. What does that change mean in that particular reach? Is it temporary or persistent? What are its sort of consequences? The third function is verify. Can observations be compared over time? Are the methods clear? Has uncertainty been communicated honestly? The fourth function is then act. That the action may be a warning, an inspection, a route adjustment, maintenance preparedness, habitat or fishery management, or planning and technical cooperation. All of these sort of function in a cycle rather than a one-way chain, where action produces new observations and a warning could be revised, a route may continue to change, and management responses may require further evidence. And so the system also learns to sort of change and adapt with the requirements of the river. This sort of observe, interpret, verify, act cycle is the operating logic of governance-oriented UDA. But this interpret stage cannot be completed by technical measurement alone. A measurable change, like I said earlier, does not automatically reveal its local significance. This is also why the UDA must be participatory. This idea of this participatory UDA is not just sort of a collection of local observations. It recognizes the different river users have different experiences in different parts of the Brahmaputra and therefore hold different forms of relevant knowledge. For example, fishers could observe changes in fish movement, habitat, turbidity, catch conditions, and fishing grounds. ferry operators could encounter changing channels and depths and landing conditions and navigational constraints in real time. Char and floodplain communities could be experiencing erosion, channel migration, disrupted access, and emerging local risks. And so I think it's important to note that these observations, they don't replace scientific monitoring, but perform a different and very necessary function. That this idea that technical tools do measure change consistently, but local knowledge can help explain to us whether that change is unusual or operationally significant or historically familiar or already affecting everyday life. And so participation therefore strengthens this interpretation step. It connects technical evidence also to lived experience. It raises questions of authority and ownership, questions like who sort of helps define what should be monitored, who decides when a change requires action, who receives and benefits from that resulting information, which are all very important questions when we speak about sort of governing a river like the Brahmaputra. And so participatory UDA does not mean that communities are treated simply as sources of raw data or recipients of knowledge, but their sort of knowledge then helps shape how the river is understood and how monitoring processes are established. Consider, for example, bathymetric change. A survey sort of may identify a shifting channel or an altered depth profile, but ferry boat operators can sort of explain whether that change has already altered approach routes, increased crossing times, exposed passengers to stronger currents, or made a landing more unreliable. Consider also, say, sediment and turbidity. Technical tools may record changing conditions, but fishers can help interact and interpret whether those changes coincide with altered fish movement, spawning conditions, catch patterns, or access to fishing grounds. Consider also, say, bank and riverbed instability. Technical evidence may indicate erosion or scour, but Char residents could help recognize local warning signs like seepage and cracking, unusual currents, and change in bank sound. My point is not that every local observation is automatically correct, but that technical evidence alone may remain contextually incomplete, that community knowledge makes the UDA locally intelligible, that it connects physical change to routines, dependencies, vulnerabilities, and locally meaningful thresholds. But participation does not simply become credible because communities have been invited into the process. It also requires sort of clear conditions. For the UDA, those conditions, the first of those conditions is validation, where scientific measurements and community observation must be examined together. Local reports can sort of be assessed against technical evidence, but technical interpretations must also be tested against lived conditions. The purpose here is not to declare one form of knowledge superior to the other, but to almost identify where they converge, where they differ, and what further evidence is required. The second condition is reciprocity. Findings must return to the communities that contribute knowledge. If fishers report habitat change or ferry operators identify a hazard, the resulting analysis or warning or management response must not remain just inside an institutional system. The third is data rights, where sort of things like ownership, access, consent, attribution, and benefit must be clear. And this sort of understanding that community-generated information could have economic, ecological, political, or safety implications as well. The fourth condition is institutional accountability, that participation must connect to a decision pathway, that questions like who receives the observation, within what period is it assessed, how is non-response recorded are all asked. Without these mechanisms, participation becomes sort of consultation in name only. It becomes evidence gathered but not really acted upon. So these are not just operational safeguards placed around the UDA framework, but conditions under which the participatory UDA produces credible and actionable intelligence. The same sort of concern with credibility and comparability also applies when underwater evidence must move across institutions and national boundaries. At the reach level, verification means comparable observations, traceable change, and methods that other institutions can examine and cross-examine. At the basin level, the task becomes more difficult because different institutions and riparian states could be using different indicators, different baselines, different monitoring systems, and different technical standards. And so this idea of hydroverification in the UDA is almost a way of extending that verification function across those boundaries. It doesn't require complete data sharing, and it does not require one central basin database, and it does not assume that technical cooperation sort of eliminates political disagreement. Its more sort of practical objective is this idea of interoperability, that selected indicators, methods, metadata, and uncertainty ranges can be made comparable. Things like sediment change or channel and bathymetric change or ecological indicators or navigation conditions may offer sort of possible areas for technical comparison and collaboration. Each of the different actors in the system may retain their own sort of ways of producing and understanding knowledge, but the selected evidences and almost sort of points of comparison should remain understandable and examinable beyond the institution that produces it. This is not to say that verification is trust, but without verification, mistrust becomes a lot harder to contain. Where evidence cannot be examined, uncertainty about river change can become suspicion about intent. And so hydroverification and this idea of hydroverification in the UDA does not aim to resolve all transboundary disagreements, but to create a more credible technical basis for discussion and reduce specific forms of uncertainty. And so the question then becomes, how can this framework be possibly tested without waiting for a comprehensive basin-wide agreement? A feasible starting point would be what I like to call a distributed pilot across selected river reaches where multiple risks interact. These risks could include things like ecological stress or erosion or community vulnerability. The aim would then not be to monitor the entire Brahmaputra all at once, but to almost test whether integrated underwater intelligence can improve decisions in specific locations. The pilot would bring together technical agencies, local authorities, researchers, and sort of local stakeholders like ferry operators and jar communities, and would connect it with bathymetric surveys, sediment monitoring, ecological indicators, and structured observations. Its sort of institutional core, as you would call it, could be what a local interpretation cell. And this cell does not aim to sort of replace existing authorities. Its purpose remains to bring together evidence, interpret what a change means, identify what remains uncertain, and then connect those findings to the institution responsible for responding. Common monitoring protocols would make observations comparable. Clear data stewardship rules would define access and responsibility. Regular technical reviews would sort of allow methods and interpretations to be revised and revisited. And most importantly, every information stream must have and will have a decision link. That if channel change is detected, the information must reach those managing the route. If habitat change is observed, it must connect to fisheries and ecological management. And this is not a proposal for a new basin authority of sorts, but almost a mechanism for connecting knowledge to responsibility through what already exists. And so its success should not be measured by the volume of data collected, but by whether underwater intelligence changes a decision. Take, for example, in safety and infrastructure, if scour is being observed, it should be then interpreted in relation to a bridge or terminal, verified through repeated evidence, and then linked to an inspection before visible failure. If fisheries and community resilience, if habitat change is detected, fishers could help interpret its implications for movement, for catch, for spawning, and management then may respond before the decline becomes severe. In navigation, bathymetric change and local reports may lead to a route adjustment, updated markers, or even targeted surveying before an accident reveals the hazard. At the basin level, Comparable evidence then sort of allows us to change the structure of disagreement. It allows the discussion to move from, is this actually occurring, to what response is appropriate, who's responsible, and how should risk be managed. These are all different applications, but they follow the same broader idea of the UDA cycle. Observe the change, interpret its consequence, verify its evidence, and connect it to action. That is the difference between collecting underwater data and then producing governance intelligence. The wider shift can also be expressed through sort of 6 movements. The first from detecting change to interpreting consequence. The second from surface indicators to integrated surface and underwater intelligence. The third from fragmented observations to sort of interoperable knowledge. The fourth from community consultation to co-produced monitoring. The fifth from reactive response to anticipatory government. And lastly, from information asymmetry to hydro verification. These are not separate reforms. They are all different parts of the same transition. That participation strengthens interpretation because it connects technical measurement to how sort of conditions are experienced on the river. Validation strengthens verification because it allows evidence to be examined rather than just accepted. And verification supports cooperation because it gives institutions a more credible basis for comparing claims. And clear responsibility turns intelligence into action. So the central shift, therefore, is sort of from governing only visible outcomes to understanding also the underwater processes producing it. That doesn't imply that every process can be completely predictable. It doesn't mean that uncertainty can be completely removed from the Brahmaputra, but it means building the capacity to recognize change earlier, understand its consequence more clearly, and preserve sort of the possibility of acting before disruption becomes crisis. This sort of brings me back to the idea with which I began, which is the invisible river. The Brahmaputra will always remain dynamic. Its channels will continue to migrate, sediment will continue to reshape the riverbed, and monsoon flows will continue to sort of reorganize entire reaches. Habitats will change, livelihoods will adapt, and institutions will continue to make decisions. The choice, therefore, is not between uncertainty and certainty. It's between certainty that remains fragmented and unmanaged, and uncertainty that is observed, interpreted, verified, and connected to bigger responsibility. That is the contribution of the UDA. It makes underwater change more observable. It creates almost a structure through which that change can be interpreted across ecological, economic, community, and strategic dimensions. And then the participatory UDA ensures that technical evidence is understood alongside the knowledge of those who live and work on the river. And hydro verification creates a basis for sort of selected evidence to be examined across institutions. And clear decision links ensure that that information does not remain trapped inside surveys, reports, or bureaucratic red tape. The ambition then is not a technologically omniscient system that claims to control the Brahmaputra. It's a more realistic and almost a more demanding form of governance, one that can recognize change before it appears only as damage, one that can communicate uncertainty honestly, and one that can act proportionately while evidence is still developing, and most importantly, one that can learn and adapt as the river continues to change. That is what it means to govern the invisible river. That governing the Brahmaputra means building the capacity to act under uncertainty and not waiting for uncertainty to disappear. And this is what the UDA could allow us to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Tejaswini, for your engaging keynote. Your presentation has showcased several important arguments and dimensions of the topic and given us much to reflect upon as we go forward. With that, I would like to transition to our expert interventions, where we will further explore these ideas and questions raised in your keynote. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sumit Vij, Assistant Professor of Sociology of Development and Change at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Dr. Vij's work focuses on participatory governance, climate and disaster governance, transboundary waters, and urban development. Dr. Vij, we are delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you, Tejaswini, for your presentation. I think it's also a new topic for me in that sense to understand the underwater. And frankly speaking, it's also was very interesting for me to look at Brahmaputra from that point of view. And what I did in this process was just taking a few notes on certain aspects that were mentioned throughout your presentation, Tejaswini. And they are not necessarily comments, but they are more questions that we can use to further ponder and see where we can take this discussion forward to. And maybe the other experts will add to that or contest to that. And I'm very much open to those ideas. So what I did was let me just reiterate. I made around 5 to 6 key points based on your presentation, and I'll try to put them in a flow if I can. But what is most important is that they are not following any particular order of importance. So please don't take them that this is a form of a bullet point. What I would rather try is to make sense of them in the larger story of underwater. So the first point that really intrigued me was the point of the invisible that you mentioned, and very rightly said that you clarified what you meant by invisible. However, I had a bit of a disagreement when you were explaining that the river Brahmaputra is a well-researched river. I find it to be completely contrary to that. It is possible that, and I'm not from that world in that sense, but I do look into that in certain aspects, that from the natural science point of view, the river Brahmaputra is well studied. And what I've also learned and noticed is that there are smaller tributaries which are very critical to Brahmaputra, whether they are in India, whether they are in Bhutan, or in Bangladesh. A lot of researchers, local researchers, have put a lot of work on them. But I still wonder whether we have enough basin-wide studies to understand the river system. And that makes me wonder whether it is really visible or not. So for me, that is one particular aspect of it. And just connecting to that story, in the later half of your presentation, you were mentioning the importance of governance, and you also kind of explained what do we mean by governance. It's not just about these natural phenomena, the geomorphology of the river or other forms of aspects that we look into it. What I also wonder is that do we have enough research on basin-wide governance of how these river systems work or could work in the future? So that's another point of that I really found to be completely invisible, at least based on my own understanding of the river system. I must say there are several examples and in the last 10 years or so, we have put out a lot of work, scientific literature on that aspect. But still, it needs a lot of work to be focused on, and especially on the political aspect of it. Again, just reiterating on this point of invisible, you mentioned these different aspects of invisible, and I found that more than processes, it's the people. They should be prioritized, and sometimes the voices of the people and these processes, these institutional processes, make sure and ensure that people and people become invisible, but also their voices are unheard. And I think that aspect is very critical, and I'm sure Mirza will put some more light on that in his expert comments. But I feel that these are the 3 or 4 key elements where I still find invisibility around Brahmaputra. Now, the other interesting aspect, and it's a bit more academic input from my side, you mentioned about mismatches, and you mentioned about several aspects that could be a mismatch in the river system like the Brahmaputra. And I feel there is a bigger, very interesting literature around scalar mismatch. And these just don't look at the institutional level or the governance, for example, but they look into the jurisdictional, but also the ecological, but also the geographical. And sometimes it's also the people who are at a mismatch. And I think that is an interesting opportunity for research to really look into Brahmaputra. I've done some work around how domestic and transboundary level mismatches happen, and that creates a lot of political void, but also instability around negotiations, interactions between the states. And I think that would also be further explained and also further researched actually in this particular aspect. Moving forward, I was very intrigued by this idea of underwater, and like I said before, that for me also it was a new insight to listen to, but also think about. And I was wondering that underwater cannot be in isolation with the surface or even the sky rivers, as we talk about nowadays. So I think there is a lot going around on those aspects. Maybe we have to rethink, or maybe it needs further clarification. Maybe you've already thought about it in terms of what happens to this surface, underwater, and sky interactions. And I think that's very interesting because it's not just what happens underwater influences on the surface, but also vice versa. And what happens in the sky rivers, what also influences the surface as well as the underwater. So I think they are very much interconnected and kind of interdependent, and they're interlinked with each other. So we really need to make that argument even more stronger and maybe look into those kind of dynamics and how these climate models work with the underwater in that sense. So I think that interaction could be very fascinating, could be very interesting. Maybe that work is done. I'm not aware of it, but I'm very curious to hear more on that. And then you mentioned there was another point about intelligence, and that was also very interesting to me. You mentioned about the ecological, economic, community, and strategic. And for me, this also comes to the political intelligence overall. And where does that fit in? For me, the most important thing, because I'm interested in the questions of power, for me, the most important thing comes is where is the political willingness? Where is that intelligence coming from? And where do we stand? And Brahmaputra is a classic case for that. I think more than institutional decisions, we have institutional non-decisions in this particular scenario. And I think that is also very interesting to look into how these decisions are not made. And from those non-decisions, who benefits and who takes advantages, whose voices are heard and whose voices are not heard. So I think in those four categories of your intelligence, I think there should be space for political intelligence too. And how does that work out? How does that play out? And I see Ambassador Tariq Karim also in our viewers. So I think it would be very interesting to hear his perspective. That I'm sure he has beautiful stories around that to mention. Then because we were talking about decision making and participation, this will be almost my last point to conclude my final remarks, is the question of participation. I think we really need a reality check on what happens on the ground. It is amazing to see what you presented, but I must say our states, whether it's the state government or is the central government, and I'm sure Mr. Pandya will have better insights on that. But what my understanding is and what I have seen on the ground is sometimes shocking of how distant the state is from the people. I've particularly done a lot of research around hydropower projects in India, but also in other countries. And I think those are classic examples of how far we are from each other. And of course, we mention about these participatory exercises, but I think we miss out complete on the ground reality of what happens to people just by the notion of saying that we will construct a dam till the dam is constructed. And the Lower Subansiri is a classic example of that. For 20 years, people believe there will be something happen, and of course now it's in some form and shape. It's up and running. But I think the question to the people still remains of what happens to them, what has happened to them for the last 20 years, and what will happen to them in the future. So I think there is a big question of participation. I'm not going to the whole EIA exercises around it and all those, but I think there is a clear example that this was not done in a proper way, if I have to put it out. And this rounds up to me as a question of power. Who has the power? Who makes the decision? And whether it's underwater, it's surface water, or the sky water, I think the question at the end lies to the political willingness and the question of power, of what we want. And sometimes I feel that as a country, I'm talking specifically of India in this case, it is not that it doesn't happen in other countries, it happens there too. Sometimes we forget that in the name of national security and development, we forget, are we really protecting our own people, or are we putting them at jeopardy? So I think that rounds my overall argument towards your presentation. I made those 6 points, and I'm very happy to hear what others think about it, and I'm happy to engage in terms of discussions taking this forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Now moving on, we would like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Mirza Zulfikar Rahman, Program Coordinator and Research Associate at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, Regional Office in New Delhi. A researcher of borderlands, ecology, and transboundary river systems, Dr. Rahman brings a rich understanding of governance, sustainability, and socio-political dimensions of the Brahmaputra Basin. Dr. Rahman, a warm welcome to you.
Much, Catherine. Thank you for your introduction, and I apologize that I cannot open my video as I'm outside, but I will. I enjoyed the presentation from Tejaswini. Definitely see this as a very, very kind of well thought out presentation and very meticulous research that has gone to it. And I commend that, this kind of a work is very, very path breaking in a way, as Sumit was saying. And Sumit's comments also I fully agree with all the points that he has made. What my points of that I wanted to actually look at in terms of comments in your work, in terms of how we look at, it was many years back, around 2010-12, when we were working on a film called Inner Lines, and this was with some a filmmaker from Guwahati, and we were actually putting our camera inside the water, and then showing the perspective from the underwater domain in the film. And that film actually also shook up a lot of people who were actually working on the river in terms of activism, in terms of policy research, in terms of artistic expressions as well. And I would recommend that film also to you if you have a chance to look at it at some point of time. It's called Inner Lines. And just to also see that anything that actually seems not so obvious becomes very, very, and I commend you to pick up this topic, who is not so well researched on. And I agree with Sumit saying that Brahmaputra is a very, very under-researched river. And the problem with that is the allocation of resources towards research by the government. And that is a primary problem that we face in our everyday work as researchers, as policy people. The allocation of resources to this kind of non-structural interventions in the river is very low, while the structural interventions in the river gain a lot of resource allocation. So what that does is that whatever kind of a ideal situation that you are actually putting out there does not become a reality in terms of implementation, in terms of furthering the discourse. And then it also makes it that, the pace of structural interventions far outpaces the pace that you want to implement in the domain, or the pace of community understanding about the river is at a different level than the pace of interventions that are currently happening on the river, in terms of river training, in terms of erosion management, in terms of kind of how you look at embankments being made across the river in a very unscientific manner, because this unscientific manner of constructing embankments did not come from a policy decision, but from a disaster that was the 1950 earthquake. The 1950 earthquake upended the landscape in such a manner that actually, and that point of time, India was just recently got independence in 1950, and there was no resources whatsoever to actually allocate to a proper scientific mapping of the river basin within the Indian context, and random embankments were made across Assam, as you see today. And once you actually intervene in that manner in order to protect important towns and important places, oil towns were there, tea gardens were there, important towns were there which had to be protected at that point of time. And it actually led to a kind of a layering of the disaster discourse. So the embankments kept layered on top of the other in an unscientific manner because of that trigger that happened during that time. And then we're still continuing with that kind of a techno fix, and that techno fix still remains. And that techno fixes also are now replaced by big hydropower dams that are being planned in the region, and then also then a lot of dredging activities that are being promised by several agencies, and a lot of scoping for that also has been planned. So how dredging also destructs the biota of the underwater, on the riverbed, for example, has not been done in a proper environmental impact assessment form. So those are matters of concern. And the general, as Sumit would also know, that the general policy, science, community interface is very, very low in the Brahmaputra River Basin. And the major reason for this also, I would point out, is that the Brahmaputra, as you said, is not only an invisible river in terms of this discourse, underwater domain, but also is a speculative river. As I call it, the Brahmaputra is a speculative river and is a frontier river. And it's a frontier river in the sense that it actually has two big powers battling over its resources, China, India, and there are two smaller countries like Bhutan and Bangladesh in the basin. So in terms of how we look at this speculation, that disinformation sometimes also makes control easier. In terms of how you actually can intervene in the river basin or not. So that for me is a very primary kind of aspect that we have to tackle. And in order to implement the ideas that you have, river, and I agree completely with you that local communities should be involved in this, and local traditional knowledge should be accounted for. And any modern scientific development should actually also imbibe traditional knowledge systems into them so that both can inform each other. And there is a kind of innovation in terms of how we look at this kind of implementation. But what happens is that we can bring in modern technology like the energy transition debate that is we are having at the moment, but is it at the end of the day rooted in justness? The just aspect is very important. Are we making the community intervention participatory and genuinely participatory? And also in the sense that what are the democratic structures that we are putting in place in a democratic country like India vis-a-vis an authoritarian regime in China? How do we actually look at our internal governance systems about river systems and make it much more just and much more transparent? Because communities living along the river do have a right of basic information about the river. And it is not only because underwater domain awareness requires this kind of a community interface to come in. It is at every level that we need that. And as Sumit was saying about sky rivers, about the mist, the subterranean levels in the below the sky rivers, above the surface water, the water levels, the ripples, the underwater, the groundwater as well. So all of these levels have to be looked at, and crowdsourcing of data and crowdsourcing of community knowledge has to happen has to happen at all levels. It is not only because underwater domain awareness requires this specific skill set. to actually corroborate its findings. So I feel that this needed to this will also require a lot of time to also get the community trust to actually be there, to come and participate in a much more responsive manner and a participatory manner, to be able to give meaningful benefit. Because many communities, as I speak to many people and while I travel along the river, have now lost interest in the river because of the high amount of interventions that has happened without their consent. So it is not an easy task to immediately bring in, say that, okay, we require this, so we need bring in this. So that may not be such a obvious kind of a aspect to look at. So we also need to bring that into focus, and also in terms of how at a transboundary level, as you had spoken, there is also this aspect of how we can actually learn from Bangladesh, from how they have made rapid strides in this domain, and they have done a lot of scientific research over the past decades, which actually has helped them in navigation and maintaining the navigation channels active, and also the diversity of kind of fish is as you also spoke about fisheries and all of that. The very diversity of fish is at stake by many of these interventions, which are happening all across in a very very kind of scientific and not properly studied manner, because the allocation at the first point towards studying the river is very very less in this kind of a river. And also it is also treated as a national security kind of a subject, because of the presence of China in the basin. And as long as the presence of China is there in the basin prominently, and it's a national security context, the data, crowdsourcing of data and availability of data, even to researchers, is very difficult. Forget about the community. So in that sense, we need to actually really look at how we can really bring in this kind of a interface where we can build this kind of a aspect where such practices. We have a kind of Northeast India has 8 states, and all the 8 states are participating in a kind of a platform called the Northeast India Water Talks, where such kind of aspects are regularly brought in, and not only in terms of climate policy aspects, but also in the vernacular. And that the vernacular understandings are also very very important in order to bring this the understanding of the river is much more than only technical knowledge or community traditional knowledge systems, but also as you said, that it is in artistic impressions, it is about also stories, the power of many stories about the river, and how the history in the time scale, how different incidents in the past, the community memories of major disasters, is also very very important to actually contextualize in this kind of aspects. So I end need to find a solution of the political borders, and not only between India, China, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, but also within Northeast India. The border between Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, for example, itself is such a big barrier towards governance between the two states itself. We find that at the micro level as well. So we need to actually underline a bioregional and eco-regional understanding of the Brahmaputra River Basin, instead of studying it in fragments, in political fragments. And because that is one of the major hindrances of being able to actually bring in this kind of fresh ideas and be able to actually pursue them with much more meaningful vigor. So I feel that bioregional and eco-regional understanding of the larger river basin will bring in a lot of solutions, and the pathway that you have lined out will also be much more realistic, and much more the countries and the respective political actors would also commit much more to those kind of than under the existing political boundaries and the mistrust that we see. The Ganga Basin Treaty that is was there for 30 years is ending in December this year. and the TISTA is still under consideration. And a lot of other like bilateral and multilateral understandings on river basins are non-existent. So we need to also build this kind of a trust from the ground up to be able to actually translate this into better mechanisms, better policy mechanisms across the transboundary level as well, and so that people at the end of the day can benefit. And I agree completely with Sumit that people at the end of the day, not the underwater, are the invisible part in these aspects. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Before we move on to the next expert intervention, it is my distinct privilege to invite Ambassador Riva Ganguly Das. Ambassador Das has had an illustrious career in the Indian Foreign Service spanning more than 3 decades, including as High Commissioner to Bangladesh. Throughout her career, she's brought together diplomacy, cultural engagement, and international cooperation, while also contributing to discussions on environmental and climate issues at a global level. Ambassador Das, we are truly honored by your presence. May I now invite you to share your remarks and reflections on the keynote and the panel discussion so far.
So thank you, Dr. Das, for organizing this event, and many thanks to Tejaswini Kartikar for presenting a fantastic work and extremely meaningful comments that we heard. This is really not a subject on which I'm an expert, so I can hardly say anything on this subject, which is to add to the meaningful discussions on this. What I basically wish to speak about is that, what I've learned from this discussion is that this is a very important tool. And I was particularly interested in what Ambassador Tariq Karim wrote in the chat box. And I'm very glad that he's here, and pleasure meeting you virtually, Ambassador. So it is a important tool that can be used. But what I understand is that it still requires a lot of work. And from what I understood from Tejaswini's presentation is that probably pilot projects on this has also not been done, if I've understood correctly. But there is no doubt that as we talk about the governing the invisible, especially in the context of Brahmaputra, there is also understanding the unknown. Because we are all aware that China, as the upper riparian, is building this extremely massive dam on the Brahmaputra, which they themselves say is going to be bigger than the Three Gorges Dam, which is the largest dam in the world. And this is projected to generate 60 gigawatts of power, will cost $137 billion. And we are talking about, the project having taken off already. So the implications of an upper riparian, undertaking a project of this magnitude, and on which so little information is publicly available, should be a cause of great concern to the two lower riparians, India, Bangladesh, as well as to the Bhutan, which is also impacted as a country which is in the basin. So I think certainly UDA can be a useful tool in this regard. But I was also very interested to see that UDA can, I mean, naturally, having been a practitioner all my life, having done diplomacy, and because water sharing is such a sensitive issue in the subcontinent. If you look at with Bangladesh, of course, the Ganga Water Treaty is coming to an end very soon, and the TISTA, which was the water sharing was agreed to, was not signed. There are 54 rivers which India and Bangladesh share, and water sharing there is very little, very small water sharing, projects which are going on. But but what I feel is that, the India-Bangladesh discussion on water does not have to be limited only to water sharing. UDA is exactly the kind of technology, the kind of governing framework which we can share, which we can talk about, which can be extremely useful in terms of dealing with as sensitive an issue as water. And we don't have to start at the massive water system like the Ganga or the Teesta or the sensitive ones. There are n number of small rivers which flow through India into Bangladesh. There are a couple of rivers which flow from India into Bangladesh, then come back to India, where, strangely, we are both the upper riparian as well as the lower riparian. So, and obviously, water is an issue on which all stakeholders are involved. And, we heard from the experts that at the end of the day, we do all this for the community, even in the broader context of your foreign policy, your engagement with your neighbors or with other powers. What you're trying to do is basically in your national interest. And whose national interest it is? It is not an abstract national interest. It's the national interest of your own citizens, your own country, your communities. So I think there is this case that you have made, Tejasvi, for the involvement of communities is a very convincing one. And being in the rivers which flow through our water, through our borders, which are probably little more not so which don't have that kind of political significance as Ganga and Teesta or the other major rivers. In a smaller major river system on our side of the border, taking into account the communities on this side of the border, if a new technology, if a new framework like a UDA can be used as a pilot project, I think we can really show an example of how neighbors can work together, for communities. And we know that in the deltaic region, we depend upon the river not only for navigation, extensively for navigation, for livelihood, for fisheries. Communities depend on it. Our culture is woven around water. Our music, our dance, you name it, and you have water in it. Water is so essential to that. So I think I have really learnt a lot from my from listening to all of you. And I think UDA can be a very powerful tool for examination of transboundary waters as well. But I think a lot of work still needs to be done. You have to start at the local level, community level, and then go up. But building awareness about UDA, building awareness of how powerful this tool is, and also creating removing some myths, because I see an automatic sort of concern about whether on security or a military perspective, because of the nature of this technology that you're talking about, nature of this framework. So I think implications of the use of UDA have to be understood a little better. But I think you've started very well, Dr. Das, and I wish you all the best as you move ahead. And there are so many young scholars involved with this, and that is really gratifying. And I'm sure in some days to come, maybe we can actually use UDA for constructive discussion between an upper riparian, lower riparian, middle riparian, in understanding what is under the waters, as you said, and also what is unknown to us, as I flagged. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a pleasure having you with us today. As we move on to the next expert, it is my privilege to welcome Sri Ashwin Pandya sir, former Secretary General of the International Commission on Irrigation and Drainage, and former Chairman of the Central Water Commission. With 4 decades of experience in water resource engineering and irrigation planning, Pandya sir has made outstanding contribution to the water sector in India and across the world. Pandya sir, we are honored to have you here today and a heartfelt welcome to you. I look forward to your valuable insights.
Thank you very much. At the outset, of course, I would like to congratulate Tejaswini for having put together a good collection of various issues that the river systems across the world really face. And Brahmaputra is a very special case because in case of Brahmaputra, the amount of water that it carries and the topography through which it traverses are highly diverse. Probably no other river system in the world has got a kind of a diversity in terms of the topography, in terms of the physics, is there. So from that angle, it's a very challenging kind of a topic. However, there are issues which have to be looked into from a national point of view, and also from a local point of view. The issues in water sector have got two dimensions. One is an anecdotal dimension. An anecdotal dimension means, I will say that there, of course, the communities are highly fragmented, and then each community would like to view this in its own particular context, and its own, and for them it is very vital. So it is not that they are doing something wrong on that front, but then there are also a kind of a overall societal context, and then overall kind of national and strategic context. So all these issues have to be really brought together, and nobody can really say that we have the overriding kind of a overriding kind of a right over something which will completely kind of negate the right of the larger community or right of a bigger group. So this particular aspect has been a very challenging aspect in water resources in general, and in Brahmaputra it is quite more, because in case of Brahmaputra the local communities are also kind of highly segregated, so to say, socially and also economically and politically, and because of that strong segregation boundaries, some of the issues which are not really creating that kind of a challenge will create a challenge in case of the areas which we are dealing with. So that aspect also has to be kept in view, that we have to see that how the mutual understanding between the communities can also develop. Now the next important aspect is that as far as the underwater domain awareness is concerned, it's a very useful kind of an initiative, but that initiative is basically a reactive initiative. The action is provided by the nature. The action is provided to you by the topography. The action is provided to you by the climate. And the rest of the things are basically reacting to it. So in this kind of an action and reaction kind of phenomena, where you do not have any control over the action, you can't change the topography, you can't change the climate, or climate will change in its own manner, which will be a global phenomena, and you don't have any control over it. And likewise, all these issues will have to be brought together. Yes, there is a need. In fact, in case of all river basins, there is a need that there has to be a kind of a common platform where the information can be exchanged, and where the very comprehensive and an authentic kind of information is available, so that any other community, when it tries to examine its interest vis-a-vis the other issues that are coming up at the hand, then they should have certain amount of explicit and certain amount of clear kind of information that is available to them. However, in case of the clarity, the areas of the areas of science, the areas of technology bring in their own complexities, and no area is actually perfect. That is true. Now the question that comes up is that when we say that the data is not available, or what kind of data, then what we have seen is that we actually try to say that you get this data for me. As a consumer, you are interested in a particular data, but then the products that are available are different. Now each of the products always gets created for a particular purpose. So it is the also a kind of a part responsibility of the consumer to see that which product really suits them. That's number one. And then which product can be tailored, or how much of a product can be really required in order to carry out their own work. And this kind of an area is also missing in case of Brahmaputra. That's a very unfortunate aspect of it. But the fact remains is that in case of Brahmaputra, we do not have such kind of comprehensive kind of a data exchange, which can then create an awareness about the implications of what we are doing and what we are not doing. For example, Ms. Rita Ganguly Das brought up this issue that when some some kind of an adversarial kind of relationship is translating onto the water resources, then what should be your actions? You cannot really, look at I can be a kind of a community. I can be a cluster of something like, let's say, 20 villages, or five, five tribes. But then the global context in which these certain things are happening also will have to be appreciated, because I am safe only when the nation is safe. I am safe when the overall situation is manageable. So these aspects are also quite severe in case of Brahmaputra Basin. At times, what sometimes gets talked about are the issues which are not really, if you really implement them in that very sense, then they will actually create a kind of a harm to somebody else. Now, for example, in case of Brahmaputra, the basin is characterized by extremely diverse kind of topography, and with a very severe kind of a climate. The climatic action in Brahmaputra is a very peculiar kind of an action, where there is a kind of a clear-cut boundary at the India-China border, as we perceive it. There is a very clear-cut boundary. If you look at the rainfall patterns, the entire flood that gets generated in Brahmaputra is primarily coming out of the Indian territories. But the lean flows are coming out of the Chinese territories. And if you miss any of these two, then what happens is that you have a situation where you will be kind of having a huge disaster in your hand, and coupled with that, there will be a huge kind of a shortfall in your hand, and that is happening within the same year. So this kind of conundrums are there, these kind of threats are there. This threat perception also has to be kind of brought into the dialogue. That what are the threats? How are you going to really mitigate them? What are the options available to you to mitigate them? And to some extent, government has been working on these kind of issues. But the propagation of these issues at the lower level are not really very clear. So this is a challenge in case of Brahmaputra, where the information exchange has not been very clear. The next important part that is happening is that at the governance level, the challenges are pretty large, and somehow or other, this integration of these challenges in a politically coherent kind of a way have not really happened. So what happens is that there are kind of disjointed kind of voices and disjointed kind of areas which have to be really brought in, and for that your idea of having a stakeholder participation is a very important and a very good idea. And for that, what is required is that we need to have set up the kind of coordinated dialogue mechanisms between the various entities. These entities are at the highest level. They will be, of course, concentrated at the state level. But then between the two states, we have to have this kind of coordination mechanisms. At the union government level, we have been trying to establish this kind of mechanisms for a very long time. But unfortunately, the political realities do not really are amenable to ultimately kind of going towards that kind of a utopia, I would say. But then at least there has to be a kind of a common understanding of mutual interests, and whether these mutual interests are getting served by whatever is being done by the various parties or by the various groups. This particular issue requires a interdisciplinary knowledge. This requires an interdisciplinary understanding. And this interdisciplinary understanding has to be developed at every level. It is not merely a government's responsibility to have all the interdisciplinary knowledge. It is also required at the community level to understand that. You have to understand that, I mean, if a flood is occurring, what could be the remedial measures through which this can be sorted out. The problems are so big that like Professor Mirza Rahman just now brought in, like the question of embankments. The issue is that the problem is so big, the investments required are so high, that you cannot really think in a situation where you can say that I will always have the ultimate solution. The ultimate solution will be beyond your resources, because your resources are common national resources, and you cannot really have a situation where you will spend resources only on one aspect, and there will be nothing on any other aspect. So this particular area also at times requires you to do some kind of a stopgap solutions, and you cannot deny those stopgap solutions. Because if you don't do that stopgap solutions, the resultant disaster would have been much larger. So the interventions that are being made also have to be understood in the context of economy, in the context of national strategy, in the context of individual comfort or community level understanding, and then there has to be, of course, the adjustment between the various things, and that is where the governance comes in. Because there is only one common agency in any kind of a modern kind of state, which is a nation. And at the nation and at the governance level, as it is devolved down the line through the state governments and through the local bodies, and this particular area of governance has to have more understanding of the issues involved, and has to be more responsive, because the people who are likely to feel harmed, or people who are likely to feel encroached upon, also have a kind of a requirement which has to be understood and which has to be met with. You cannot meet everything in one go, but then at least what we have seen is that if you make an economic sense of what is happening to them, and with that economic sense, if they can if they can be kind of given a kind of an outcome which is a little better than what they have, then this kind of resistance and this kind of mismatches can be reduced to a great extent. So there are actually very multiple kind of areas. There are certain constraints and there are opportunities. The constraints have to be converted into opportunities. For example, in case of Brahmaputra, you have a constraint. You have a constraint in a geological sense, like what you have in case of let us say northwestern Himalayas, where you have got a frontal kind of foothills, shivaliks and others, who are different than the greater Himalayas. In case of northeast, you have no such boundary. The greater Himalayas suddenly end into a plain. You look at Pasighat, what happens? Now, when you are facing with these kind of issues, then the translation of these issues into opportunities have to be understood, and those kind of developments have to be properly sold to the communities, and then communities also have to be brought in. And there is a lot of political also kind of and governance kind of issues that are also there, which has to be brought in. But all said and done, yes, I mean, all those things cannot be done in a day. We have to have a lot of work still pending on us. But the fact remains is that we need to have what I will call basin dialogues. See, when you look at it from a geographer's point of view, or when you look at it from a social point of view, then you actually look at the river as a kind of a linear feature. And you talk about that linear feature. But that is one of the most misunderstood kind of concepts in the non-hydrology communities. The river is not a river, it's a basin. The basin has to be understood well. And then you will understand the river in a better sense. And for understanding the basin, yes, you have to understand all these issues. Like underwater domain definitely also addresses to the topographical issues. Domain can also address to the hydrological and climatic issues, and then also will also understand how the water environment, or the environment which is fed by the water and which is sustained by the water, is really working. So for this, a kind of a good kind of dialogues have to be there. The various parts of the basin which are also contributing to the river. Today, the water that you see in Ganga or in Brahmaputra is not the water of Brahmaputra. It is water of every square inch of that particular territory that has ultimately translated into that particular flow at that point. So it is not that the stakeholder who is directly affected by the river is the stakeholder. A stakeholder is also located in a several hundred kilometers away, and his interests and your interests will also have to be gelled, will also have to be matched. So this is an issue where a very strong stakeholder participation is necessary. A very strong stakeholder inter-understanding is necessary. And for that, developing such mechanisms can come through the governance, because otherwise it becomes very difficult that the individual structures or individual initiatives can actually give you the difference. So we need to really look at the Brahmaputra also in that context, and we need to have a kind of a good governance structure which is able to provide adequate space to the individual stakeholders, also make them educated or make them understand about the mutual interests. And those mutual interests and those mutual cooperative kind of area will have to really come to a governance model or to a governance area, which can then kind of felt generally satisfactory by everybody. So I feel that we need to look at this these kind of studies in this manner, and that will probably give us a kind of a solution. Even though there are no solutions, we haven't have a single basin in the world where I can say that all the issues have been solved. So issues will remain. We are changing. We are continuously changing our climate. We are continuously changing our development paradigms. We are continuously changing our economic concepts of what is a good life is, and then all this ultimately reflect on the water. So we will have to really work in this direction for Brahmaputra. So thank you very much, and it was a great pleasure interacting with all of you and learning about all your views, and it gives you a lot of food for thought. So thank you very much for organizing this seminar, and also thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of it.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. I would request Ambassador Tariq Karim, sir, to kindly give his final comments, sir.
Okay, am I unmuted now? Yes.
Yes, sir, we can hear you, sir. We can't see you.
Yeah,
we can hear you.
Because I could not unmute myself. The host had to do that. I actually joined to listen to everything, but I followed this intro, and it seems between my earlier interactions and discussions on the Brahmaputra over a decade ago to now, I see a certain flexibility of approach and a certain opening of mindsets being reflected in the discussions here. And I commented Tejaswini for an excellent presentation. But as Mr. Pandya pointed out, the river has to be looked as a composite whole. It has to be looked as a basin. It has to be addressed as a sum of its parts, not the part of a whole. And this is the tragedy that and I attribute it to our history and the legacy of history, where the partition syndrome basically the rivers cannot be partitioned. The job of the water of the river is to flow, and when we stop that flow, the river takes its revenge. I mean, I learned in China that they look at each river as a force of nature, and that the force of nature each river has its own personality, and they have to address the personality as a whole before they can train it. They can never tame it. In India also, you look at the river as representations of deities. They have persona. They have divine persona, actually. And in Bangladesh, the legal system gives each river a legal entity with rights to which we have responsibilities. So it's not a reciprocal. The river has no responsibility for it. A river will just flow, and it will flow, and over 60% of the water just flows into the sea. And our problem is, as again Mr. Pandya pointed out, that most of the Brahmaputra waters, for the greater part of the year, 8 to 9 months, the source is from what I have described as the lower Brahmaputra. That's after it makes its U-turn at the Great Bend and falls into Arunachal. Okay. The upper Brahmaputra can affect us to some extent, but for the greater part of the year, it is the lower Brahmaputra. And 60% of the water we just allow it to flow through Bangladesh. Unless we get away from this concept of resource nationalism, you can apply nationalism to many, many things, but you cannot apply the nationalist rules to shared commons which flow to everyone. I think this is one of the problems which you have within India also, because in your constitution, you have given the sovereignty of the river to each state. And because of that problem, you have the perpetual, for the last 80 years, the problems between the southern rivers. You have not been able to resolve it. So if you have not, and now you're also getting increasing problems also on the Himalayan rivers coming down. The Ganges for us, it flows through 6 states of India or 7 states, I've forgotten, before it enters Bangladesh. Okay. And so you already have disputes developing between the states in India as to what will be done with the waters. So we cannot talk of rivers as sharing a division of the spoils. Unfortunately, that is the paradigm and the narrative into which we have locked ourselves in. And politics, whether it's domestic politics or transboundary politics, sort of reinforces that. we have to get away from it. And I think here we have to look at the example of the two European rivers. I mean, the Rhine and Danube, they've had governance frameworks for about 200 years. It's even before the world wars and the different wars they fought with each other did not adversely impact on how they managed the rivers. They understood that everybody's well-being and life depended on that. And I think that is where we have to move to. So the suggestions made by Tejaswini in her papers, I think that is a good pathway in trying to, because we all need to understand the nature of the river, and we can only do that if we are working together. And I would strongly suggest, Commander Das, that you take an initiative. I was in a meeting about 3 months or 4 months ago, where there were Chinese participants also on discussing the Brahmaputra, where Anamika was also a partner. And I think we need to carry that forward. You know, when I first told the Chinese some 8, 10 years ago that, look, let us look at the Brahmaputra as upper and lower, because we can't get funding from international agencies if a river is disputed. So first they were reluctant to accept the idea, but when I explained to them that, look, we cannot stop water flowing to you. You have all the means of stopping the water flowing to us. But the reality is that 70% of our water is after the river crosses into Arunachal. So let us deal with that ourselves. Of course, now they have brought up again the dispute on the territory on Arunachal. But that, I think, is something we can still work around. Okay. So we have to work. Bangladesh as a state has been always saying, and particularly since 2010, that let us focus more on management, holistic management of the river basin, rather than, you know, focusing our attention on contested disputes of how much share we are getting on each side. And perhaps that will lead us to a situation where we will be better able to trap some water, hold it when we have less water, and use it, you know, during the drought season. And in the surplus, we have to think about how to control floods. Now, yesterday or day before yesterday, I read a newspaper report which was alarming, because, well, I was aware that of the fact that the glaciers are retreating at an alarming rate. They may disappear by the end of the century, or at least 80% will be gone. But the permafrost is also disappearing. And rivers are changing the course, because rivers, as living entities, they adapt to whatever resource they're getting. And the changing of courses, I think we need to focus on what's going to happen and start taking measures on how we are going to protect the communities that are going to be affected. So these are my preliminary comments on this. This discussion, I hope you will share it with us also. Certainly, it's a additional volume. But what I'm hearing is that everybody is talking more and more about, you know, my good friend Sumit also mentioned the same thing. We have to now look at the rivers more holistically, and we have to think about managing it. You know, if it's a persona, whether in your mythology or on your belief system, or in our legal system here, or in the scientific manner with the Chinese, then the persona cannot be, you cannot think of carving up the persona, dissecting it, and one person taking one arm and the other person taking one leg. You know, you have to think of how you live with that persona to make it help you. That's the approach we should take. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Really appreciate your comments, sir. And we will certainly share all the reports of these webinars. I mean, the previous one where you were also a panelist, and this one and the next one also we will be. And of course, Tejaswini is almost completing her monograph on the Brahmaputra, covering various such aspects. And we really thank all the panelists for their very insightful and very, very pragmatic comments. And Tejaswini, I'm sure, has noted down all the points that have been given, and we will certainly incorporate. And we really appreciate all of you with so much of in-depth understanding and expertise on the subject and multidisciplinary expertise. So we really thank you for all that. Pandya sir, thank you very much for sparing your time and joining us. And I always valued your comments and always valued your advice. And we have certainly taken note of, and we will all share this discussion as in the form of a report with all of you. And we hope to take this forward going forward. And we'll be also reaching out to you to contribute a paper or a chapter for our effort on the Brahmaputra. Dr. Vij, thank you so much. Really appreciate, and we'll continue this discussion, and we'll also seek opportunities to work together. Dr. Mirza, thank you very much. In spite of your busy schedule and travel, you made it possible to participate and give your very insightful comments. And thank you very much. Ambassador Karim, sir, thank you very much. So we will continue to connect with you and take this discussion forward. Tejaswini, very well done. Thank you very much for your great presentation. Catherine, thank you so much for coordinating this in a very professional manner. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.